Hello, and welcome. Welcome to the Learn on Demand Systems Did You Know series of webinars. We run these weekly on Thursdays. Today's session, Proving that Coders Can Code. My name is Brian Bork. I am here with our readiness team. Just a couple of notes here before we get started. You can always type your questions in the question section of the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to do so at any point. We'll try to get your questions answered as best we can, both in the chat and at the end during the QA session. I'll be happy to read back any questions and provide any answers that I can. So, what are we going to talk about today? Other than the fact that it's about proving that coders can code, we're going to do a quick recap of terms and phrases. We are going to get started and show you how you can create a lab with a Windows VM and Visual Studio Code. Now, when you create a lab with Windows VM and Visual Studio Code, you can then use that VM as a way of verifying that somebody did something correctly. And we're going to talk about how you verify what they have done. Then we're going to take a quick look at using containers, Docker containers inside of lab profiles to be able to work with scripting and coding. And then last but not least, we're going to create labs that use our Code Labs feature or platform or fabric. Those are kind of interchangeable here. And we are going to talk about getting around and testing and evaluating the code. Now, one thing before we move forward is that I'm going to be using the terms lab profile and labs, but I want to be clear, this is not about developing teaching labs. This is about assessing coder skill. Now, while my labs will have some instructions that tell people to do things, it's all about being able to do things correctly. And if you are able to do them correctly, testing them and making sure that they come out on the other side. This is about assessing coders' skills. So even though we're going to talk about the term lab profile, we're going to be using the terms exams, labs, and assessments sort of interchangeably here, because as soon as you turn on scoring, you're getting the equivalent of what we call an exam, but it is developed as a lab and then it is made available as an exam. So just want to make sure that we get all of that terminology down. First of all, as far as what we are talking about when we talk about coders, we're talking about coders, programmers, and developers, all is the same sort of skill set. Now, I realize that programmers, developers, and coders all may have different skill sets that tie into coding and writing code and writing scripts or programs. But somebody who is a HTML coder or a Markdown coder, for instance, might not be writing scripting or might not be writing programs. But all of these types of skill sets can be tested and assessed using code labs. Now, you can't have code labs without having a lab profile. So we're going to talk about what a lab profile is. The lab profile, gets you your launch button, but then it's the thing that ties all of your contents together, whether it be a container or a virtual machine or a cloud slice or code fabric or code lab fabric, as we sometimes refer to it. All of those components get put together along with removable media and your instructions, special formatting, special settings for this particular launch instance, things like themes and so on. All of that get tied together inside of a lab profile. Now, that lab profile, as soon as you score it, becomes an exam in our parlance, but that might be an assessment, that might be still considered a lab on your side. But remember, what we're trying to do is we're trying to assess whether or not somebody is capable of being able to code. Now, we're going to talk about lab platforms. Sometimes these are referred to as lab fabrics, and this is what type of technology you're going to run on. So for example, if you're using a virtual machine or machines, those are typically run inside of Hyper-V or VMware in our data center. They could also be run inside of AWS or Azure if you wanted to do sort of cloud technologies and cloud hosting. Containers are Docker containers. They're hosted in an environment where we go and obtain the Docker container from the repository and then store it in our storage online. Code Labs is a completely separate platform. That means when you select Code Labs, while you can integrate cloud and make a hybrid, which is the next situation, Code Labs replaces the VM or container or any of that type of technology. And as you'll see, it gives you a completely different environment than either virtual machines, containers, or just cloud. Hybrid scenarios give you the ability to do things like containers with virtual machines or virtual machines with cloud or containers with cloud. All of that type of technology would be considered a hybrid scenario. All right, so now that we've got our terminology down, what are the challenges of getting people trained on or testing to see whether they've been trained when we're talking about coding? Because each coder has their own way of doing things. They might write if then else statements instead of for each statements. They might not know the specific function that they need to create, but they've got good code inside of the main body of the programming. All of this different type of technology can and does sort of get in the way of testing them. Up until now, that is, because we now have the ability to be able to test them on how they do those things. It is tough to evaluate their skills without a person or persons examining the code that they generate. So if I'm a person who is just out of school and I've learned programming in C or C#, and I'm just out of school and I'm looking for a job, it is tough to go and find a job without them giving me an assignment of here's what we want to do, send us your code and let us run it and make sure that it actually does what it needs to do. And then somebody's got to sit down and look at it and do what needs to be done in order to evaluate whether it's successful. Well, what if you could replace that person looking at it with technology looking at it? Well, you can. And that's what Code Lab and the Code Lab fabric or platform is all about. The other thing that gets in the way of being able to test coders is coders like to try different ways to accomplish the same goal. So they might want to try two different languages. Like maybe if I execute this in Python, it runs pretty quick, but then if I execute it in C, it works even better. So they want to try multiple languages. They want to try different routines or different functions to see which one works best. Well, what if you can give them an environment that allows them to do that? That's what we're talking about today. And enough talk, well, not talk per se, but let's get into looking at these code labs in action. So I'm going to get out of my slideshow here and we're going to go right into the demonstration. You'll see here that I have a lab series that is set up. This is as a standard lab developer inside of Lab on Demand. But it is important to note that we are going to be creating a set of lab profiles, but we're not going to call them labs. We're going to call them assessments, or we're going to call them exams, or we're going to call them classes or tests. Whatever you want to call them, don't think of them as really labs for educating. These are labs to see whether or not somebody can complete the tasks, okay? So we're going to start off with all of these examples are fairly basic, but we're starting off with a very basic example of a lab profile that is using a virtual machine or VM. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this here, and I'll minimize my screen, and here you go. This is very typical to a education part of working with labs, and it is a virtual machine on the left side, a set of instructions on the right hand side. But what we're going to be doing now is seeing whether or not somebody actually was able to do what needed to be done. So we're going to go ahead and launch Visual Studio Code. This is just as an example. I don't want you to think of this as the only way of doing this, but this is a perfect example of something that would need to be done in a VM. And why does it need to be done in a VM? Because there's a GUI component. You want to see a graphical representation of this example. And what is this example that I'm talking about? Well, it is a simple Python file. Well, it's not really that simple. I certainly couldn't write it from scratch, and I didn't. This is available online. It is what is referred to as the Sierpinski gasket, which is essentially just a fractal based on triangles. That's all it is. And but as you can see on the right hand side here, we do have a lot of code that we're covering. I'm sorry, on the left hand side, I said right. But we're not concerned with all of this code. First of all, we want to make sure this code runs. I'm using Visual Studio Code. We could be doing this example with Visual Studio. It doesn't matter because all we're looking at is the code after it's been done. So I'm going to go ahead and run this just to prove that it does actually run. So this compiles real quick on, we're using Python here. And here is that graphical component that I was talking about. This can't be done unless it's through a web interface in a container. And right now, the results of the code can't be displayed inside of a code lab. But that, the future is still coming. So we will see what will happen. But you can see here that I can do fill and I can do contour and I can increment this. I can turn the fill off or the contour off. Got all of the different capabilities here. All right, so everything works great. But we are challenging somebody to change this color to, instead of using only blue, to change the contour color to brown. So I'm going to scroll down here to where I know this is, but this would be one of those things where you told somebody, change the secondary color or the contour color. They would have to know where to go and do this. Now, they may not know the color that you want them to do. So you would say hex value of B8, 5100, whatever. So you do need to have some skills. You need to have some understanding. And then we just go in and change this real quick. And I'm just going to have type text do that work for me. And then make sure you save your work. And there it goes. And then I rerun my program. And you see here, everything still works. But when we switch to contour, now we've got this sort of dark red brown. Okay. Now, my personal opinion is I have proven to myself that I have done this correctly. I could submit this code. I could maybe copy and paste it, or I could submit it online or something like that. But there's an easier way of doing this. We could just click on check your work, which runs a scoring report. And good job. We will record your victory. And if we look at our instructions here, this activity that is being done, you see here that my instructions don't have the activity. The activity is being done here is very basic. We're using I need to make this slightly bigger so that we don't have to scroll quite so much. There we go. There we go. You see here, we're doing very basic PowerShell, going in and looking at the content of a file and seeing if it has the new color in it. Now, this is a very basic example, but you could nest your PowerShell and make sure that this exists inside of this and that they're using a for each, and you could check for virtually anything and make sure that they did the job that they needed to do. That's one way of checking. You could also build in all sorts of dynamic content. Like you could say, I want you to use just this random color. Here's the hex code for it, and give them no other instructions. And then they go in and do it. They click on the check button. Now, you don't even have to give them the check button. You could just have them submit the result. And when they do that, let me just close my window here. They click on submit, and they'll submit it for grading, and it will tell them whether or not they did it successfully. You did it successfully, close. And now when we go back and take a look at our lab instances or exam results, either way, but let's just take a look at the lab instance. You as a possible employer, or as somebody who wanted to verify that somebody learned how to do something, you can click on the details, and here you can see whether or not they were successful. Now, you can also go in and review what it was you were having them check. All right, lots of stuff. Okay, that is sort of the old school method. And what I mean by old school is not that it is old technology, it's just this is one way of verifying skills. Another way of verifying skills is to use a container. This is a Python container, which is held in a Docker repository. And if I launch this, you'll see it launches pretty quick. And you'll see here that it takes a few seconds to launch, but what we're doing here is we're launching a container. Now, a container is slightly different than a VM in the fact that while you still get the thing to do on the left-hand side, it is not a complete virtual machine. It is sort of just a always available complete environment. And quite honestly, that's not significantly different than a VM. But this is nothing but Python. The only way I can integrate with this, the only way I can talk to this is with Python. So for example, here, I'm going to set x equal to 42, and then we are going to do a little check to see what x is, and if x is equal, exactly equal, we're going to, I'm sorry, if it is, yes, if it is equal to 42, it will print, it'll print yes, and then if it's not equal to 42 other than greater than, so in other words, less than, it will print maybe. So if we set x to equal to 24, we're going to print maybe. So I could do this all day. I could say x equals, and I'm typing now instead, 45, and hit enter, and then run my line once again, and now it says no. All right, now these are just very basic code examples, but we can do a little bit better. We can verify that things have been done. So for example, we want them to set up a HTTP server. So I'm going to take this code here, and this is generated by Learn on Demand Systems. I am going to take this website and I'm going to try to access it. Oops. Using my browser. Here we go. I'm going to add a new, and what you're going to see is that we can't reach this site. I'm going to leave that up and running, and now I'm going to say your responsibility is through code, through only Python, get a web server up and running on this machine. So or on this container. So I'm going to run these lines. I'm using the type text only because I don't want you to have to sit here and watch me mistype several times. And I'm going to put these in on single lines. If I wanted to, I could have this code reside inside of the container and then have somebody make a call to it, but I just chose to do it this way. And hit enter. And now this is listening. And now if I refresh, there it is. Now, if I had actual HTML on this container already, it would be available for me, and it would be able to display the content that was needed here. So that's That is a quick and easy way of verifying skills using a container. Can you do this using a container? And especially when that container only contains nothing but a, oops, Control C. There we go. Now I was out of my, I'm out of my web server, and I can go ahead and end my lab. But it gives me a way of validating skills without having to take a screenshot or send an email or something like that. We can verify that people have done what they needed to do. All right, for our last two examples, we are now moving into the code lab territory, and we're going to use the simplest example we can have. What is a number plus 1? That is a simple enough task. Even I can do that math. And there is there's a very easy way of getting code labs or lab testing or testing of somebody's coding skills using a simple checkbox. And I am in our production environment, I'm sorry, development environment here. And you'll notice that instead of having a platform like Hyper-V or VMware or anything like that, I have a checkbox here for Code Lab Fabric. And if I uncheck that, you can see here that now I go back to my virtualization platforms. But if I check that, all I get is the Code Lab Fabric. Now, I'm not going to save this because I don't want to accidentally save it incorrectly. This has already been built for me, so all I need to do is click on Launch. And once it is a code lab, oh, let me get rid of that in the background. Once our code lab comes up, now you see something a little bit different. While it is very similar to our other interfaces, now we have our code editor in the upper left-hand corner. We have some options and settings in our lower left-hand side, and then our typical instructions and resources on the right-hand side. Please note, there are no instructions, there are no resources in this particular case, but I could very easily have instructions saying, write a code that does X plus 1. Now, the code that is here is in Python, all right, which is fine. Maybe that's the programming language that I want to prove to you I know how to use. However, what if I wanted to use a different language? Or what if in my capabilities, I list that I use both JavaScript or Java and Python? Well, how can I add that? You can add languages as a lab developer or code tester developer. You're going to go in and edit your instructions. And now in your instructions, for those of you who are eagle-eyed, you may notice that we now not only have our standard editor features here, but there's a little extra one in here called Code Fabric. And when we click on this, this gives us our interface for building these environments. I'm going to add a couple of languages here, and I'm going to put in, as I mentioned, let's say JavaScript. And you can see here that it puts in a template for me for JavaScript, and I'm going to add in C. And now it puts in a template for C. Now, what are these templates and how do I, how can I work with this? Well, you can actually go in here and modify this template. So let's just say, for example, and I'm goofing around here. This is not something you would typically do, but let's just say I put Brian was here inside of my template. And now I save this. I'll come back to the rest of the features here in just a second. And make sure I save my instructions, come back and reload my page. And one thing you'll notice is that Python is still here, but if I do my dropdown, now I have other languages I can use, like JavaScript and like C. And notice that an eagle-eyed lab developer, or excuse me, an eagle-eyed coder would come in and say, oh, this is junk. We don't need that in there. So they would delete that and then test run their code to see whether or not it did what needed to be doing. So this gives them an editor right here inside of a common, or at least very similar looking lab interface, the ability to run that code and compare it to tests that you generate. All right. So let's just say, for example, notice that this ran in C. I could run this in Python. And when I finish running the code, my tests are still good. Now, let's say that, for example, I go in here and I say +2 instead of +1. As a coder, I'm not very good at math. Now I run my code and my tests are going to come through and say, no, you didn't get those tests correct. Keep editing this, keep working on this. But if I switch back to my C, you'll notice that didn't impact my C. Now, if I run my code, test 1 and test 2 both come back as green. So this gives, remember the challenges we talked about? The fact that people like to work in multiple languages, they like to retry over and over to try to get their best results. Please note that in the output, they see the time elapsed here too. So if they're doing large code, they will actually be able to determine which language runs fastest and which, particular, maybe the for next loop takes 14 milliseconds and the if then else takes 10 seconds. Well, let's run the one that takes 10 seconds, right? So this is how you can test the coder's skills. So I'm just going to show you one more thing real quick in our environment. And that is these tests. You build the tests to make sure that the coder codes things correctly. That's how it works. You are looking and working inside of a coding environment, but you don't know what they're going to write. All you care about is, can they get the expected output when you give them a specific input? So you see here, test 1 is 1, test 2 is 2. That's the input you're giving. And the expected output is 2 and 3. Well, let's add a test real quick, and let's do test 3. Now, this would be very difficult to make correct, but let's say the input is 3 and your output, instead of being 4, because that's what we expect, would be 3 instead. Please note that you can also turn on scoring available here, and you'll see that example in just a few minutes. And you can also remove these if you need to. So if I go ahead and click save and make sure I save my instructions, close my window, refresh my browser, and I go in, remember I had my input +2 here in Python, so I'm going to switch that back. Now I'm going to run my code, and my first 2 should come back green, but test 3 came back as incorrect. So you could say, in the first half of this lab, we would like you to write code that makes test 1 work. And then further on, say, we'd like you to make test 2 work. And then we'd like you to make test 3 work. And then say, now write code that makes all of these tests work. Well, it would be very difficult to make code that would do this unless you put in an if then else, where if the number is 3, don't add any number. But just to show you that I can get that correct, I'm going to switch this from input +1 to input +0. And now test 1 and test 2 aren't going to work, but test 3 does. Okay. Once again, very simplistic example, but I wanted to show you the fact that all of the languages are there, or that you can add those languages. And one last example here, and then we will get you some resources and get you on your way. And I like this example because this is a leap year calculator, but it's not really a calculator so much as it is a verifier of skills. So let's go ahead and launch this. Once again, this is in CodeLab. So it launches very quickly because we're not loading a VM, we're just loading the lab interface. Now, one thing I'd like to say is that these templates in here were built correctly. You would not give somebody this template. What you would give them would be something that looks like this. All right, that would be your template. We did this because we wanted to show you a complete example from the various languages that are out there. Okay. Oh, speaking of that, if somebody were to get very lost and very confused in their lab, and they're like, oh, this code doesn't run and I can't get anything to work, let's get back to where we were supposed to be. I can actually just click on reset or reload, and it will actually reload my environment. Now, like I said, this is available. Now, notice we have almost all of our languages in here. We're actually just missing JavaScript because we just added it and this hasn't been updated since. But we have almost all of our languages here. So if I wanted to run this in Python, you can see here, this is how we do it inside of Python. If we want to do it inside of C, we do this here. Now, here's the cool part though. When I switch, first of all, you see here the coding challenge. We want you to generate this. Here is the interesting or pertinent points. Now go to it. Then test your work. Now, you see here that we put in our C solution, but watch what happens when I change my language in the upper left to Python. Notice my solution also changes. So if I go in and take a look at my instructions really quick here, you will see that we have our page break right here, okay? And then here are the different sections. Each one of them is a code language. And what we do is we actually recognize when you switch the code language up in the upper left-hand corner, and then that changes the code language here, which changes what your solution is here. And that works for Ruby or C# as well. So let's just run this code real quick and then we'll verify it. Once again, how many leap years have occurred since 2000? How many leap years occurred since 1600? Is 2020 a leap year? And then you can see here that we do all of this calculation, and look, all of our tests come back as matching. Once again, a simplistic example, although I couldn't have written this code to save my life. And once again, maybe I got some of this right or some of this wrong. Like, let's say that I figured out whether 2020 or 2021 is a leap year, but I didn't calculate 2000 or 1600. So I'm just going to remove some stuff and I'm going to go ahead and run my code. And you'll see here that it is test 1 comes and test 2 come back as incorrect. Now, another thing I want to show you is when you edit my instructions and go to Code Lab, you will see here under my test that all of these are scored, and we can even put a number of points so we can weigh one part of this more than others. So for example, getting how many have occurred since 1600 was more valuable than just determining how many have occurred since 2000. But notice that we also have to know the answers for these, right? So if we're calculating something, if we're asking them to do something, we have to know what the output is going to be. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and save this one more time and save my instructions, even though autosave would have been set. Run my code one more time just to make sure that my tests come back, and then I'm going to go ahead and submit this. Click on yes. And I'll get a grade. Oh, sorry, you only got 2 out of 5. Remember that test 2 had 2 points to it. So I could have been 50-50, but instead I'm actually below 50%. So once again, you as a lab developer or operations manager or whatever, you can go in and look at your exam results, and you can see here what the person got right and what the person got wrong. Okay. So that, in a nutshell, is all of the stuff we have on Code Labs. Now, these are continuing to develop and morph, and we're going to have more ways of being able to check VMs and more ways of being able to check containers. And Code Labs is only going to get more and more capable of being able to do things and run tests. If you want to learn more about Code Labs, you can check out lods.1/code-labs, no spaces. You've already joined us for a Did You Know demo, but you can join us weekly on Thursdays. You can find the schedule and register online. If you've already been here, you've already registered, but by all means, register for the next one coming up as well. LODS.1/featured demos, all one word, no spaces. And then we have our even deeper dives, monthly lab developer workshop, our next one coming up on May 27th, and all about Cloud Slice Labs. And then quarterly launch event, a 2-day event held every quarter for lab developers, operation managers, and business development managers. Next one coming up June 16th and 17th. And that's at LODS.1/launch. And with that, I will run through and check for any questions. It doesn't look like there are any at first glance, but I'll double check. Otherwise, I want to thank you all for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you at another webinar soon.